We're today in St. Columba's cemetery, or graveyard actually, I think is the right term, in Swords, and we're going to look at some very ancient headstones which are part of the history of the area. It's the last day of our Swords Heritage Week and it's kind of raining a bit, so we just have a few people here, but as I say, we're going to talk about the interesting headstones. We're standing here in front of a lot of bushes which covers up the grave of the Russell Cruce family from Drynham House. Now, the Russell Cruce family were in the news recently because there was all this thing about Tom Cruce being descended from them, and whether he was or whether he wasn't, they said he was, but they did get some information from research we had done, apart from the other stuff they did themselves. But unfortunately, the headstone has fallen and it's lying face down. And the Russell Cruces were in Drynham from the 15th century, and one of them was an Archbishop of Dublin who died in penal times, and they were a very historic family. And in old records of Swords, like right up to say 1900, there was always a Russell Cruce on local committees, and you see the names. Now, my knowledge of them is when they sold Drynham House, I think in the 1920s, the last lady who lived there was a Miss Gabrielle Russell Cruce, and she moved to Mountgorry, and she lived opposite to where I was reared. And I vaguely remember this old lady. My mother used to do her shopping, and I remember as a small child being sent across the road to go in, and I was afraid of her. She was very tall and austere with white hair in a bun. But I have, when I was born, she actually put a 5-shilling piece in my hand, and I still have that. And I have a few little bits and pieces that she gave me, and that's and a lot of people around Drynham remember her, and remember the family. But they only a lot of people claim to be related, but the one lady I know is Miss Etna Russell Cruce, and she's about 80 now, and she lives out in Dalkey. So we might get talking to her and see can we do something about restoring the grave. So I think that's it. So anybody want to ask anything? No. Right, well maybe we'll go on. One John Sweetman, who's a United Irishman, and you have some details of the inscription there. I don't have it in front of me, but Sweetmans were a family. Here's Mary Watson now too. I shouldn't be saying that in the middle of the video.
He has arisen.
But somebody said it's better to do it that way. Yeah, I shot. No, anyway, the family of Sweetman lived in a place called Foxhall in Raheny, which was later the old Sheeling Hotel, and they were brewers. They had businesses in town, and this man John Sweetman inherited one of and I think he married somebody called Sweetman. I think that was the story. But he had his business they had a business in Hawkins Street, and I think where was the other place? I think it was. But anyway, he got involved with the United Irishmen, and he was a friend of Wolfe Tone's. And when the Rising came in 1798, and that he helped a man called Rowan Hamilton escape to France through the place over in Raheny. They had a boat, and he got away from Baldoyle and got away from France. And he was in his office either in Hawkins Street or Francis Street one day, and the soldiers all came in and arrested him, and he was taken to Kilmainham, and then he ended up in Scotland, and then he was in political asylum in France, which meant he wasn't allowed to come back to Dublin. But he kept in touch with what was going on, and he also fancied himself as an amateur architect. And around that time, Archbishop Troy of Dublin, who's a Dominican, decided he wanted to build a proper cathedral for the Catholics in the city. And it was meant to be where the Gresham Hotel is, but because it was before Catholic emancipation, it was shoved up Marlborough Street. But they set about forming a committee, and the records show that they bought houses in Marlborough Street belonging to the Earl of Tyrone, is it? That was there?
Tyrone House is
Tyrone House, yeah, because after the Act of Union, these people all moved to London, you see, and these houses were being sold off. And 83 Marlborough Street, I think, and that's the home of the priests belonged to the Pro Cathedral, because it was somebody that was there a few years ago that was instrumental in helping me to research this. So, they decided then that they bought the site, and they decided they would hold a competition for the design of the church, and various entries came in, and this one was sent from Paris by John Sweetman, and they accepted that one. Now, some people say that he didn't design it at all, that it was some French guy called Labat who was supposed to have been Napoleon's architect, and he didn't want to send it here because Napoleon was at war with England. But if you go into the Pro Cathedral and get a book, they say that John Sweetman designed it, and we like to think he designed it because he's buried here. So he eventually was allowed, I think the Pro Cathedral was officially opened, someone was 1823 or 4, but yes, and Sweetman had come back and he was too ill to be at, and he died shortly after that, and he was buried here in Swords in the family grave, and that's it. So in 1790, when the 1798 celebrations went on here in 1998, we marched up here and put a wreath on it, and a man called John Sweetman turned up, who's a direct descendant, and we let him put the wreath on it, and he went over to Paris and noseyed around. The design is supposed to be like a church in Paris, like it's kind of Grecian design, you know, the pillars. So I think it's authentic enough that Sweetman had a hand in it. Now, the other thing that tied in with that, when I was doing the book on Columba Church on the Stations of the Cross, I researched all the donors of the Stations of the Cross, which were put up in about 1881 or 82. But there was this one of Valentine and Monica O'Connor, and I couldn't find anything on them, and I said there was no Valentine O'Connor lived around Swords. Just by accident, I saw this thing about this 83 Marlborough Street in the paper one night, and there was a father Sheridan there at the time, who was originally from Rush, and I knew him and he was into history. So we discovered that this Valentine O'Connor was a solicitor who was on that committee that built the Pro Cathedral, and so obviously he had some connections out here, or maybe when he died he left money for the station, I'm not too sure, but that was the connection. Valentine and Monica O'Connor are buried in the Pro Cathedral because this father Sheridan sent me out a copy of it. So the rest of them down there were all from around Swords and you know, Kettles and all these, you know, Colonel Foster and them. So that's that.
Enormous big crypt in that church.
Yeah.
Right under Moffatt Street.
Yeah. Well, Kit Sheridan, he went. We found. Yeah. He found it, like he sent me out a picture of the inscription, so that's where Valentine, if you're ever looking in Columba Church and they ask you, that's where they're buried, and that's who they are. They basically, I don't think they had anything to do with swords, you know what I mean? So I think they just maybe left money for Catholic things. Okay. To the memory of John Sweetman, Esquire, of Fox House in the county of Dublin, by his widow Eleanor Sweetman. Testimony of the most sincere and genuine affection which she bore her husband in this graveyard. And according to, that sounds funny, doesn't it? And according to tradition, also buried on the 23rd of May 1826, John Sweetman, aged 70, who was arrested in 1798 as a member of the Directory of the United Irishmen. He was brother of the above Patrick Sweetman, who died in 1793. The tomb was restored and the above John Sweetman's name added in 1818 by John Sweetman of Drumbarrick. Now that's in County Meath, I think, in the county of Meath, yeah, the great grandson of the above Patrick Sweetman.
Okay.
Now we're here at the grave of one Thomas Moffatt, and there's a lot of controversial history in Swords to do with education, and Thomas Moffatt was one of the forerunners. It's about the Old Borough School, as it was called, which was the Borough School. And in After the Act of Union, the borough was disenfranchised, which meant it lost its 2 members of Parliament, and people were claiming money and compensation and what. But the powers that be granted £15,000, and it was decided to build, with the money, it was decided to build a school for the poor of the parish without religious distinction. And that's something to remember about this whole controversy. So they decided, they bought this site down where it's a pub now, down there on the main street, and because it was before Catholic emancipation, the body politic which they were told to form were all Protestants. The Archbishop of Dublin and the Provost of Trinity College, the local rector, and there was a superintendent, I think he was called Cholmley, who lived over in Malahide, and I named a housing estate called Cholmley over there near the Malahide Swords Road, Malahide end. But there's an awful lot to talk about in this, but the first schoolmaster they employed was a man called John Carmichael, and he was there for a while, and I think he got sick and he died, and this man Thomas Moffatt was employed, and he was there for years. And they were now I've written a whole essay on this, and they were kind of fiddling, in other words, to put it like in present day language, but they weren't using the money that was allocated for what it was intended, in other words, and most of the poor of the parish were Catholics, and the children were there. But on the other hand, if you got into the school, there were a lot of perks went with it. There was free coal, and they had a doctor, and I have a lot of old receipts where they used to cut the children's hair, and they were apprenticed then to various things at the end, the best pupils. But it all went kind of haywire. But this man Moffatt used to be called Mad Tom Moffatt, and they all hated him. And what happened then, about 1824, a new parish priest came to Columba's church, a Father Carey. He was responsible for building the new church down there, but he rambled up one day to have a look and see what was happening, and he discovered that they were proselytising, that they were actually teaching the children Protestant psalms, and there was more memorials going back and forward to try and sort this out, and it went on. It wasn't settled in Father Carey's lifetime. It wasn't settled till about 1880, long after he died, and it's too long, I think, to tell all about now. But this fella Moffatt was the demon of the peace, and briefly, when there was a big inquiry in about 1850, and the Catholics, they maintained they should have got their share of the money to build their own school, there's record in the Freeman's Journal where they had a meeting in the graveyard in Columba, and Colonel Foster from Swords House and all these were involved, and they decided that they went on strike, and they took all their children out of the borough school, which meant that if there were no children going, they couldn't keep it going because there weren't enough Protestants. And eventually, through Cardinal Cullen, they got a grant of £800, and they built their own school down on the Seatown Road, which is now Prosper Fingal, down, you know where that is. It used to be the boys' school in our time. So it went on, and then they were told, Moffatt had his son-in-law and his daughter teaching in the school as well, and there was money allocated to teach the kids agriculture, and to teach the girls sewing and that, but the girls used to be brought back at night and made sew shirts, and the teacher, she was bringing them into Dublin and selling them to somebody in Sackville Street and keeping the money for herself, all this kind of thing went. There's an awful lot in it, because I did an essay from Maynooth on it, and it's a whole book that I did. There's an awful lot of stuff in it, and even in what I did, there was more I could have put in, you know. But eventually eventually he died. It says on that, you have to think that he was 90 and he's buried there. So I'm convinced that he's buried in someone else's grave. Now, I've been back and forward emailing this man in Canada, this Tom Moffatt, and he said that your man's wife was somebody called Catherine Brownrigg Connolly from Kildare, and we have a record that they were married in Kildare, and I'm friendly with the local studies librarian in Kildare, and he found a reference to him in some charter school in Selbridge, and there was a problem there, and an inquiry about beating the kids and being violent to them. So obviously he was into that before he came here, you know. So eventually what I said, you know the way when you conclude your essay, I said that the people that were on the board of governors, they never came out to see what was going on, and I said that the local people knew better what suited them, because when it was sorted out, there was an Archbishop, Willie Walsh of Dublin, and Archbishop Plunkett was the Protestant, and that was in about 1880. They came to an agreement, and the money was shared out per head of children, and now I forgot, the Catholics got 11/13 and the Protestants got 2/13 of the money for some reason, and they were allowed to keep the old school, and that's how they called it the Old Borough School, and the Protestant or the Catholic one then was the New Borough School. And they decided then they would have two different boards of governors, one for the Catholic and one for the Protestant, and there were local people on it, and I think that local people know better what suits them. And after that, education in Swords had a very good name. The schools weren't they, Mary? That was, you know, that they all did very well out of it. But the mystery, I still have to solve this mystery, and I'm still working on to see there was something about the Bishop of Kildare had something to do with this church, and maybe your man's wife might have been related or something, and maybe that's why they were buried there. But there's somebody else's name called King on the top of that, and there is a King in the parish registers here, like a child, and the father was an alderman of Dublin, it says. So we're still trying to chase it up, and that's the story of Tom Moffatt. But he seemed to have been a terror, and the wags used to say, God save us and keep Black Moffatt from us, or something like that, you know. There was an article in one of those old Dublin Society records long ago by a man called Moylan, and it's worth reading, you know. So there you are.
There, Michael.
We're here now at the grave of the Tailors of Swords. Now, it's a very peculiar inscription which I've been looking at for about 20 years, and I've asked a lot of people that I thought knew more than I did for a logical explanation, and nobody has given me one. But it says this stone was erected by John Tailor of Swords, the ground being 9 foot long and 6 broad, situated north side of the altar, being the ancient burial place of his family, September 9, 1725. Now, the Tailors of Swords lived in Swords House, which is down where the county hall is now, and they were in the town from about the 13th century, because there's a record that Walter Taylor built a mansion house in Swords in 1403, and it probably was altered over the years, but they were an Anglo-Norman family who came from a place called Beverley in Yorkshire, and I'd say they settled here because the castle was built around 1200 and it was a Norman castle, so I was imagining there was some connection as to why they came there. But the people come in here. I gave a talk to the Chamber of Commerce or somebody one time, but I was saying that there was early trading, because there was an Alexander Taylor who had a license to buy fish and import it to Liverpool, and that was going on that time there. But the Taylors, this particular inscription and this thing about 9 foot broad and wall, and now it's definitely not north of the altar, because north of the altar would have been it wouldn't have been that church at all. It would have been the old monastic settlement. But the 9, I don't know why that was. Maybe like after Catholic emancipation, there was a time when like Catholics had no graves, and I've seen a record somewhere where some of these Protestants wouldn't let them in or something. So unless he put that on it to sort of stake his claim. The other thing, I had another guy out here called Rob Goodbody, who's a planner in Dublin City Council and very knowledgeable, and he said, oh, maybe they wrote down the thing for the fellow and he carved the whole thing onto it, and that sounds logical enough. So I don't know, but I as I say, I've asked. I've had a lot of kind of people, as I said, that know more than I do, and I've asked them all. Now the Tailor crest is there, and I forget what it says in Latin, but it means prudent like a serpent. But the Tailors were one of these families who remained Catholic, and the Mass and Swords and Penal Times used to be said in their house, and there's a lot of records about a monk coming from Sutton to say the Mass in the house, and he used to call swords Villa Gladiorum, which he thought it was something to do with the swords that you fight with, but so there's various things that went down through the years, and you're asking me where the Tailors here related. Now I wouldn't dispute, I wouldn't say they're not, because I have a family tree of the Tailors, and they all it's like a who's who of all the big families all around the area. They married a Fagan of Feltram and a Barnwall, and all these people married into one another. Must have been to keep the land in the area or something. And Delafield, remember we the woman from America that was researching Delafields. All these people married into one another. But this family tree that I had, it seems to only give the records for the eldest son all the time that inherited. So, and a lot of them had 10 children. So I wouldn't dispute that these are not descended from them. Do you know what I mean? They like to think they are, which is no harm because they're there. But in actual fact, old Mark Taylor came from Rush, as some real swords people might point out. Isn't that right, Mary? That's right, yeah. But the other thing about the Tailors, and to branch off, there was a second son called Francis Taylor who went into Dublin and became very prosperous as a merchant and a man about town. He was mayor of Dublin at one time, and then of course he wouldn't sign the oath for, what did you call that oath? No, yeah, maybe it is. He wouldn't turn Protestant, like, in other words, and he was put in prison and he died eventually. He was 72 or something, and he was one of the Irish martyrs who was beatified. And when that happened in 1993, I got a letter from the Archbishop to go to a meeting in his house, and I was on a committee in there, and we held, because of Francis Taylor, and we held a seminar down in the Amos Centre, and it was very good, So there was another woman within those called Madam Ball, and she was related to the Tailors and that. So eventually it came on down, and the last man there was Colonel Foster, and his mother was what was her name? Anne Taylor. She inherited through the female line, and I was talking to somebody else. There was a James Taylor there at the time who donated the site for Columba's church, and he wasn't married, and I was talking to somebody else who lived in one of the great houses, Lady Mary Corbley's daughter, Mrs. Barrett, that we interviewed one time, and she said he was a bit eccentric, and that's how the girl inherited, and she married this Josiah Foster, who was from a place called St. Croix or something in the West Indies, but he came here and he seemed to be very much involved in the doings of the town and this committee, about sorting out the borough school and all that kind of thing. And then Colonel Foster, you see his name on a lot of old documents. He was on the committee of the school, on the first committee that the Catholics had for the Catholic school, and the dispensary and lots of things like that. And he fought in what they used to call Victoria's Little War, the war to do with the Suez Canal and Turkey. And this is another story, I'll ramble off. When I was small, my mother used to go to Dublin every Saturday. and we'd be waiting to get the bus home along the Liffey Wall, and I used to see vans going around with Tel El Kabar written on them, or TK, and I used to say, Mommy, what does that mean? And she said she didn't know, you see. So I forgot all about it eventually, and when I began to research Colonel Foster for the book that I did, I discovered that it was the name of a place where he had fought, and there's a lot of history about the general that was over him was General Wolsey from Inchicore, and when the battle was over, one of these places was called Tel El Kabar, and one of the men came back. He was from Monkstown, and he got involved in the dairy, and he decided he would call it after this Tel El Kabar, which turned into TEK, which you might have seen on milk bottles. Isn't that right? So that's just a little aside. So that's the Tailors of Swords. So it's now the County Hall, and the last time we had a cultural night over, and it was over in Rollstown, and I got up and said, since that County Hall came there, I've been at several launches in it, and nobody has got up and said what was there before, and I feel they should have something up about Healy Hutchinson, and they should have something up about the Tailors of Swords. So the Heritage Office is supposed to be doing something about it, but we'll see. He's prudent like a serpent. So somebody translated for me. So that's the Tailors of Sins, prudent like a serpent. So somebody translated for me. So that's the Tailors of Swords. Now we're at a grave here, still in St. Columba's, of Patrick Dunn of Swords, who died on the 22nd of December 1904, and it's in a bit better condition, this one, because it's not quite so old, but there's an interesting story attached to it. He was 51 years, and Martha Lucy, who was his daughter, died in June 1920, aged 27, and Catherine Mary died the 18th of July 1916, aged 24, interred in Steville, I think, Holland. Sister Patricia's died the 21st of December 1916, aged 25, and interred at St. Moritz, Germany. Daughters of the above, and of his wife Anna Mary, died the 28th of January 1933, aged 79 years. Now, this family used to own a bakery in Swords, down sort of opposite the courthouse. Yeah, Beheavy's. And I found that they had donated one of the stations. I found quite a lot of information about them, but obviously some of the daughters were nuns, and maybe if they were well off. It was fashionable years ago, if you had TB, to go to Switzerland to try and recover, which could be, I don't know, but the story I have about them is, I was walking around the castle one day with Michael Lynch, who used to be the head of the Parks Department, and I was talking about this family, and he said, there's a record of that down in the Cobb papers in Newbridge. He says, get Pather Bates to give it to you. So we discovered how it started off was, we got a letter, it was a long time ago, from somebody in Boston saying that Aunt Matilda owned Swords Castle, and they wanted to trace their roots. So I kept saying, how could somebody, and it was Dunn was the name. And then I said, gosh, I remember my mother saying that there was Dunn's, the baker's, and the bakery was up against the castle wall, because the chimney is still there. And I came up here and looked at this, and we researched it, and I wrote back, and she still insisted that they owned Swords Castle, and I said they couldn't have owned Swords Castle, like it was the home of the Norman Archbishop of Dublin. So when I was talking to Michael Lynch, he says there's a record that they had opened a gate out into the castle, and they were showing people around or something, and they had a row with the Cobbs, and I got the map, and there is a door, and there's talk about, because of safety now, there should be a second entrance to the castle, which is not a good idea for the makeup of it, but they're going to use the door that these Dunns made, but they were, Aunt Matilda was half right. They seemed to be quite prosperous. Patrick Dunn was a master baker, and they had the shop, and the wife's name was Doolittle. She came from Wicklow, and I traced the record, a lot of stuff on them, and they had somebody to mind the children and all like that. So obviously they were pretty well off. And they used to have a man called one of the Swans. Swans. What was that? Kit Swan. It used to be their bread man. And according to Paddy O'Neill's stuff, that shop closed down in the 1930s. So that would make sense because she died in 1933. So it's quite an interesting one. Okay. Sorry? Did he? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there was somebody else on said they married one of them as well, you know. Yeah. Well, a lot of them seem to have died young now, but it doesn't say whether he had any sons or not. I must look that up again, mate. Remind me, we look it up again and see how it came about, you know.
Yeah, but Mrs. Healy and I, her brother Healy, she bought the piano in Kettles, and the piano came back to Dawn's house.
Oh, right.
Healy's shop.
Well, this one, Catherine, she was from Wicklow, and because I looked it up, and her people seem to have had a pub or something down in Wicklow, and her name was Catherine Doolittle. Well, obviously she was doing plenty if she was running the shop. So this is now buried round there, and some of them were buried like not too long ago. And those that Beck Wilson, that was in the old IRA, he's buried round there, and they have it written, you know, Kitty Kelly's relation. Yeah. So that's about the most interesting ones now.
Just looking at the cross there and the circle in it, goes back to St. Patrick's time, and he was he did convert us all to Christianity. It was a bit of a con job because all the Irish were pagans at the time, and while the circle gives a little support to the granite cross, but it's to show the pagans in those days. The circle really represents the sun, and the cross is the Christ. And he said, you know, like, we're all worshipping the same God. It's all the one, and they believed him, and the kings believed him, and it took off from there. So most of our Christian traditions come from paganism. That's the connection with the circle.
And there is a cross on the top of the round tower, which wouldn't have been on the original. It was put on by a vicar like in the 18th century, and it's to depict that the tower was of Christian rather than pagan origin, you know. But so that's about it. It's getting a bit chilly now, isn't it?